So I've been involved with gambling in the UK for almost 20 years now. I was not a gambling researcher. I didn't have any particular interest in gambling over what anyone of my age would have had until I was asked to be on the BUD committee. So this is a gambling review body. And that was around about 2000. And we had been asked by the government to look at a whole range of issues around gambling. And in particular, people were worried about the rise of the internet, and we were also particularly looking at issues of advertising. I'll come on to that in a moment. But just to give you a sense of where we were, scratch cards had been recently introduced. We had scare stories in the media that scratch cards were the crack cocaine of gambling. You may have heard that phrase once or twice about other products. Scratch cards were going to ruin the lives of older teenagers, younger adults. The internet had just developed to a point where you could load up images on your screen. It wasn't very fast. At home there was no broadband. We had dial-up. But we had a succession of people telling us that every office was going to be transformed into a slot machine arcade because people were going to be playing slots, fruit machine slots, on their home computers and on their desktops. And so these were the scares that we had and we were thinking about. But to go back a bit further, it was fascinating for me being on the BUD review because we had to look at something about the history of regulation of gambling in the UK and how it differed maybe from some other countries. So I'm sure you will all know that until the 1950s, off-track gambling in the UK was illegal. You could gamble at racetracks, of which there were many more then than there are now, horse and dogs. Many more cities had a dog track. The only exception to this was the turf accountant, which was a highly specialized form of off-track betting. It was a form of credit betting, and very few people used it. I mean, at this time, very few people even had bank accounts, relatively. So it was a very minor part of the industry. So off-track betting was illegal. But despite that, research has been done that said that in some cities, up to about 25% of the population were gambling illegally every week. So if you read novels, British novels from the 40s and 50s, there's a character called the bookie's runner who goes from shop to shop or knocks on doors, taking bets on horses or numbers games. You have sometimes the police chasing the bookie's runner over the garden fence. And this was part of British culture certainly in the 1950s. And what was happening is that betting, illegal betting, off-track betting was a big cash industry. So it was attracting a lot of crime. It was leading to corruption. There are many stories of bookies working out of people's back gardens under a marquee in the back garden or in a back parlour. And someone in the police force, local police force, would tip off the bookie that there was going to be a raid next week. So the illegal bookie, would make sure there was almost nothing to grab, but there would be something, and there'd be a bribe going back to the police, and so on. And so it was realized that having the industry, off-track industry, non-permitted was criminalizing a large number of otherwise law-abiding people. It was creating corruption. It was filling up the magistrates' courts and was generally very inefficient and leading also to brutality in enforcing debts and people not having the winning bets paid out as well. And so legislation in the 1960s legalized off-track betting in a highly regulated fashion. It also legalized casinos in a completely incompetent way. And we went from having no casinos to about 1,000 casinos in the country. And this is what gave rise to the London gangland. The infamous gangland of the Crays and the Richardsons got their start with the botched legislation of the 1960s legalizing casinos. We can talk more about that if people want to. But there was a second act which then cracked down again, and all of those casinos were closed down, and a new regime came in, which is, roughly speaking, with a few modifications, what we still have now for casinos. But if we go back to the bookmakers and the introduction of bookmakers, the government attitude at that time was probably that we would rather not have off-track gambling. On-track gambling was considered okay, fine, a validated type of activity, but off-track gambling was not an approved form of behavior. Nevertheless, it was a very popular form of behavior, and it was accepted that we could not stop it. So really we had two choices. Do we allow off-track gambling to happen illegally, criminalizing people, introducing crime, or do we regulate it in some way to make it a safer form of behavior? And we chose to regulate, and eventually 3 principles of regulation of gambling were introduced by Lady Littler, who was at that time the chair of the gambling board, and we still have these 3 principles. So one is to keep crime out, the second is fairness to the punter, and the third, which is most difficult in a way, is protecting the vulnerable. So thinking about problem gambling and children. So keeping crime out, fairness to the punter, and protecting the vulnerable. And those were the reasons why we introduced legal off-track betting and betting shops. Now, when I was growing up in the 60s, 70s, there were no betting shops on the high street. They were all in tertiary locations, not even secondary locations, tertiary locations. So they would be not just off the high street, but round the back. And you could not look in to a betting shop. When they first came in, they were not allowed to serve any type of food. They were not allowed to have a toilet. They were not allowed to have a radio stream. They were not allowed to pay out the winnings during racing hours because of the worry that people might recycle their winnings. And the overriding concept of regulating gambling at that time was unstimulated demand. So the idea was that we know people are going to gamble, may think this is a bad thing, may think it's a good thing. The government's view was probably that it was a bad thing, but we couldn't stop it. We know people are going to gamble. Therefore, we have to give them a safe outlet in order to gamble, but we can't do anything to promote gambling. So at that time, gambling was not, you could not advertise. And I think the original conception of a betting shop was that it would be rather like a bureau de change now. You go along, you do the transaction, and you leave. And even in the 1970s, early 1970s, there was a discussion of whether there should be a criminal offence called loitering in a betting shop. Okay. So this did not go down well, I think, certainly not with the industry. And there was a royal commission that looked at this question, and they said, well, personally, we would not like to spend our afternoons in the betting shop, but we don't think it's for us to tell other people how to spend their afternoons. Even if we'd rather have them spending their time playing with their children or gardening, that's not for us as a liberal society to tell people how to spend their time. But looking back now at that time, the way that we regulated gambling in the 1960s was very similar to the way that we regulated prostitution. So that it wasn't illegal to offer prostitution, but it was illegal to advertise. And it's not identical because there's an offence, which there still is, an offence, living off immoral earnings, which applies to prostitution. We never had that for gambling. But we could have done. And so let me explain a bit more about this. Now, there's an Australian theorist of gambling who has very helpfully distinguished 3 different questions that often get confused together when we're talking about the ethics of gambling. So one is whether it is right or wrong to gamble or not. So quite often now people raise that question, is it wrong to gamble? And I think in contemporary society there are relatively few groups who say actually it's wrong to gamble. There are some, mostly church groups. A friend of mine who's a Quaker has always been worried of me having any association at all with the gambling industry because, from his point of view, gambling is morally wrong. Why is it wrong? Because one person's gain is always another person's loss, and that is not morally acceptable from his point of view. But this is obviously, as you know, a minority view now. So one question, is it right or wrong to gamble? Second question, is it right or wrong to promote gambling? Okay, so to encourage people to gamble who would not otherwise be gambling. So this concerns advertising. And a third question is it right or wrong to profit from other people's gambling? Okay, there's a question, is it right or wrong to gamble? Is it right or wrong to promote gambling? And is it right or wrong to profit from other people's gambling? And what happens in this debate, I think, is that the questions get muddied together very often. So if you want to defend the right to profit from gambling, the easiest thing to do is to pretend your opponents are against gambling. So if you want to defend the gambling business, you can say it's only people who are against gambling who would be against us. And you see it the other way around. If you want to promote gambling, you might say it's just about individual freedom. It's not about the profit people can make. So if you think about our old gambling regime in this country, what we said was, yes, it's okay to gamble. Yes, it's okay to profit from gambling, but no, it's not okay to promote it. So in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s, 1990s even, you couldn't advertise gambling to the point where a casino was not even allowed to have a sign outside that said casino. So if you wanted to gamble in a casino, you normally had to ask a taxi driver where the casinos were, because you couldn't find out just from walking around the street. You wouldn't know that a building was a casino. So we had this regime that said it's okay to gamble, it's not okay to promote it, but it's okay to profit from it. Other countries have dealt with this differently. So France, for a long time, casinos were owned by the state. So this is quite interesting. They said it's okay to gamble, maybe it's okay to promote gambling, but it's not okay for private individuals to profit from other people's gambling. I think the same has been true in Sweden at various times. So you can see that the questions can be answered differently. And in this country for a while, of course, we had the tote, which was a nationalized industry, which was the government profiting from gambling. So I think, as far as the moral debate is concerned, merely showing that it's morally okay for people to gamble is not quite yet enough to show why it is okay for there to be gambling business. This is not for me to say I'm against there being gambling business. I wouldn't be here if I did think that, but it is interestingly a different moral question. Yeah. How do we resolve it? Well, I think it's very hard to know what the fundamental principles would be. But what it means, I think, is that the existence of gambling business has a level of moral scrutiny over and above the existence of gambling in a society. That is, as gambling businesses, you have a certain level of social responsibility in a type of informal social contract to permit the business to exist. Because we could easily move, well, not easily, but we could possibly move to a system where we still had gambling in this country, but without gambling businesses. So you need to show a type of level of social responsibility and a type of added value in having business. Now, I know this is meant to be a debate, so I'm very happy to take questions. I'm not sure, or comments at any point. I'm not sure how easy it is going to be for people to... Oh, there is a microphone at the back. Excellent. So I should have said I'm quite happy to be interrupted at any point. So if anyone wishes to make a comment at this stage or ask a question at this stage, I'm happy to take it. If there's anyone who wishes to raise anything? No? If not, yeah, please. Can you just wait for the microphone? Yeah.
Hi. Could you maybe just talk a bit about how, I guess, that narrative or the questions that are asked about the ethics of gambling differs maybe like in the States or like in countries in Asia?
Okay, excellent question. So I'll go back a bit to get to that. So on the Bud Committee, the reason why we were asked to look at gambling was really twofold. So one thing I'd mentioned was the rise of the internet. And we were very concerned about the effect the internet would have on gambling behavior. We were also very worried that because of British tax law about gambling, sites would operate offshore and that we would have no control over them. So we had to look at the tax policy there. We were also concerned about advertising. And the reason for this is that, as I said, we had this concept of unstimulated demand. You couldn't advertise gambling. Except, of course, there was one big exception to this. The government itself advertised the lottery. And there was a big Saturday night program. It was in everyone's living room. The lottery was promoted all through the country to a great degree. And the gambling industry started to claim that this was unfair competition. So that the industry was not, the government was not following its own rules. And there were even dark murmurs that the European Court of Competition would be brought in to tell the government it couldn't violate its own rules on advertising. And so I think the government had a type of compact with the industry that said, we'll look at this, we'll have a committee. It's not a royal commission, but it's a review body, and we'll look at advertising. And we were hamstrung because, in a way, we had to harmonize the regulations between the industry and the lottery, but we weren't allowed to make any recommendations about the lottery. It was outside our terms of reference. So, in effect, we were told to legalize advertising. We were, in effect, instructed to make that recommendation, which we did. But all along, we were very worried about problem gambling, and this was the big issue. We got, it's gone out of fashion now, I think, as a topic, but one of the major issues was children gambling. So in the UK, I think, may be the only country that regulates gambling which allows children to gamble. So there are no age limits on gambling on some products. So very small stake slot machines, penny falls, they're called. You see them at the seaside where you put your 2p in a slot and it knocks things backwards and forwards. We don't really regard this as gambling, but it is a game of chance. And also those crane machines where you put in your money and try and pick up a teddy bear. They pretend to be games of skill, but they're really gambling machines because the grip has a random element in it. So those are gambling machines that we allow young children to gamble on. And we had quite a few people writing and saying, this is ridiculous, this is the 20th century as it was, or coming into the 21st century, and we're allowing children under 18 to gamble, we should stop it. Every seaside MP wrote us a letter. It was an identical letter, and it was obviously written by the trade association, and it said that if we ban children from gambling, this would be the end of the British holiday, and there would be depression all around the seaside where there already was depression. And all this does is, I think their phrase was, add spice to a bit of fun. Allowing children to gamble adds spice to a bit of fun. And so 50 different or 25 different MPs all wrote the same letter with that in it. Okay. So we were being lobbied on that, but in fact we thought it was not a very big deal. And so we thought it was more trouble than it was worth to go there. But we were really interested at this time, what's so interesting about the debate is if you've been viewing it in the way I have for the last 20 years, there's always a new product and there's always a moral panic about it. So the moral panic at the moment, as you know, is about the fixed odds betting terminals. At the time we had the Bud review, the moral panic had been about the scratch cards. A bit later on, while we were in the course of the review, spread betting became more popular. There were one or two stories of people losing vast amounts of money spread betting, going to prison because of their debts, or even suicide in tragic cases. So the newspapers were full of stories about the evils of spread betting. When we tried to look into spread betting to see how much problems it was causing, we could hardly find anyone who was doing any spread betting. There was no statistically significant information about it because it was such a specialized thing. But if you read the newspapers, you would have thought it was everywhere. And a friend of mine said that if you go back far enough, the accumulator, which we regard as a perfectly innocent bet now, where you put on a number of different bets on different events and let it accumulate. There was the same moral panic about the accumulator as there was about the scratch card, spread betting, fixed odds betting terminals, because it was a new product. And it was actually designed to get around the regulations, because in those days you couldn't re-bet your winnings. You couldn't restake your winnings, because betting shops wouldn't pay out until the end of the day. But in this case, you could put on 5 bets accumulating. People said, this is going to be so addictive that life is going to come to an end. So we constantly have this idea, there's a new product, this is going to be causing all the problems, and of course, it focuses a lot of attention in the newspapers. But at that time, we were worried about slot machines, we were worried about scratch cards, we were worried about people betting on their phones, which were just beginning. We're thinking about, what do we do about these cases? And also we were worried about casinos, and this is where the other jurisdictions come in. Because there's very little research done on gambling. I mean, in the UK, there'd been very little academic research. There's been research done by trade associations, research done by private companies, but in terms of objective academic research, very little, because there was very little funding. So we were looking at research from America, where there'd been a lot more funding, research from Australia, research from South Africa. And we were getting horror stories about what happens when you introduce a new casino. And because people were, in these other countries, casinos were introduced really to raise revenue for the government. So you would get a license, a single license to open a casino, and you'd have to do some sort of social good in return and pay a lot of tax. So the government saw betting as an opportunity to raise revenue. With the exception of the lottery, that has never been part of the official reason for regulating in the UK. In the UK, it's always been about social control, always been about fairness to the punter, keeping crime out, and protecting the vulnerable. Of course, it has made a lot of money for the government as well. That has never been the primary objective. Every other country, pretty much, it has been the primary objective to raise money for the government. And what they've done in other countries, virtually every other country, gambling is still regulated as if we're living under feudalism rather than under capitalism. Because what we do is, in other countries, is give one operator a license to operate. You have to pay a lot of money for your license, and then you're granted a monopoly in an area for it. We don't do that. Of course, you have to pay a license fee, but it's much smaller here, and you're not given a monopoly. You compete with other operators. So this makes the cultures completely different. And it means that you can't take research from one jurisdiction and apply it unproblematically to another jurisdiction. So, for example, when casinos were introduced in South Africa, where there had been no casinos before, there were a lot of gambling problems as a result. So people thought, so therefore, if we open a big new casino in the UK, we're going to get all these gambling problems. I was unsure about that because we had a much more mature gambling culture. And so the fact that we might introduce in casino doesn't mean that people are going to be sort of sucked into that. So I used the analogy of swimming pools. So imagine you have a country that has never had a swimming pool, and suddenly you open a lot of swimming pools. Now, you're going to expect quite a few deaths unless you do something to guard against it. But if you've got a country that has had a lot of swimming pools, and people are used to swimming pools, opening a few bigger swimming pools is very unlikely to have the same effect as opening a first big swimming pool in a country that's never had them. But a lot of the research was about that very first, introducing the new casino in a new area. So most of that research was irrelevant to us. And most other countries, there's a type of culture of binge gambling rather than slow gambling. So, when I was doing this work, I was probably in my 30s, I was asking American friends if they'd ever placed a legal bet. And most of my American friends had never done that. All of my British friends had. The only times they'd bet would be if they'd gone to Las Vegas or Atlantic City, and then they would have gone there for 3 days just to bet. The idea of going somewhere to bet for 3 days would have seemed to me like a nightmare, really, rather than a vacation, but that's what they wanted to do. So we have this sort of drip betting culture, and they have a binge betting culture. And so it's going to be quite different to think about individual behavior and what types of protections are needed. So I think we have a lower, even though there's a lot of scares about problem gambling, we have a lower rate of problem gambling than Australia, than the US. Even though adolescent gambling is legal in the UK and illegal in the US, there's a higher rate of adolescent problem gambling in the US than in the UK. So it shows really the regulations have less effect on problem gambling than we might think. There are aspects of culture and upbringing, I think, that may have greater effects. So my long answer to your question is that, of course, the ethical questions are the same everywhere. But what you need to do to protect the vulnerable is going to be a matter of history and culture. And we in the UK have got quite a mature betting culture where it has been part of people's lives for a long time. So the types of safeguards we need to put in place would be different, I think, to a country that is opening something up for the first time, where I think the safeguards would need to be very much higher than you'd need here. That may be a slightly unfashionable view in some circles. Yeah, please.
You've talked a bit about, obviously, regulation. I think it was the Lord Chadlington in the House of Lords here, end of November last year, brought up the subject of potentially having, or interesting idea of, an independent regulator being required in the UK. You touched on sort of the capitalist nature of the gambling industry in the UK now. Obviously, that's evolved hugely since 2005. The Gambling Commission obviously has derived, it's got its license provisions, license principles out there, which clearly advise and make recommendations and principles to license holders. One big problem that I'm seeing at the minute is the capitalist nature of the industry competing arguably against those principles for competitive edge. Yeah. Obviously, the government has outsourced the GamStop to the RGA. Do you feel it's time to have a look at perhaps an independent body, independent
regulator?
Independent regulator.
Yeah.
Basically to address concerns, new trends, new technologies that perhaps the Gambling Commission isn't really built to do.
So I have to confess it's something I haven't given a lot of thought to. I suppose I wonder in what way would an independent regulator be better than the Gambling Commission?
Perhaps clearer, firm directives about what you can and cannot do, rather than recommendations to go above and beyond what our principles say.
Right, okay. I mean, I think part of the Gambling Commission, and of course with the Budd Commission, one of the overall objectives was that gambling is recognised as a legitimate business sector, and that we need to have a balance between social protection and the ability for an industry to flourish. And I suppose you might think an independent regulator might just look at the social protection side and not so much the economics, although, of course, you will always want to have that type of balance. I'm not sure. I think maybe the Gambling Commission is too narrow in its scope of reference. Because I think if you think, what do people object to about gambling at the moment? I think probably the thing that people are most unhappy with are the proliferation of bookies on the high street. So if you're asking people what they think is going wrong with the industry, there are just too many outlets at the moment. And I don't think that's anything within the Gambling Commission's control. We tried in Budd. So my great regret in Budd was not making a bigger fuss about one thing in particular. So before Budd, there was a demand test, which in practice was interpreted as saying you can't have betting offices closer than, I think, 400 yards away from each other. So if you had one on a high street, probably the chances are you couldn't have another one on the high street because you were already meeting the demand. We said, no, we don't like that idea. We think that should be, in theory, in principle, the possibility of having more, but it should be up to the local authorities to decide. So we wanted to delegate much more to the local authority, because you could have one authority who was pro-gambling, another that was anti-gambling, and they ought to have that control. What we had not anticipated was a combination of factors. That one, at that time, betting offices were in the same planning class as banks and building societies, and that the rise of the internet and consolidation in the banking and the building society industry would mean there would be lots of vacant sites and people wanting to get rid of banks and building societies that already had the licensing. So what happened was, as far as I understand it, that bookmakers could move into vacated sites from building societies and banks without going through local planning. Now, we weren't the planning experts. Someone further down the chain should have picked that up, I think. But what it meant was, until very recently, local authorities actually ended up having no power over what ended up on the high street. I think now finally the planning laws have changed, and it's sui generis, the class is sui generis, so you have to get permission to open up a new shop, but probably the high streets are saturated and people are not. In fact, I think some branches are closing down rather than opening now, so we've probably hit the peak, so it's too late. So I think if there was going to be a different type of regulation, whether it should be government or independent, I don't have a view on. I think maybe there is a reason for having someone who has an overview of the industry as a whole, rather than just a licensing condition. So I suppose I would probably support that, but I don't want to be quoted on it because I haven't given it enough thought. Okay. Any other? Want to come in? Okay. Well, okay. So the work I did with the well, first of all, one of the recommendations of the Budd report, one of the recommendations that we thought would never be accepted, was that we recommended that the industry set up a charity to deal with problem gambling. And this is what had happened in South Africa, and we were advised by Peter Collins, who'd worked in South Africa, that rather than having a levy on the industry to pay for problem gambling, this would be a more efficient and actually more responsible way of proceeding, and also be much cheaper because an independent charity would not have the overheads of a government department. And so we recommended that the industry got together and came up with a charitable body, and we also said how much it should raise in the first year, which was a figure of £3 million. And people said, how did you get that? Was it? Ha, ha, ha. There are 300,000 problem gamblers, and we'll do a tenner each for them. And actually, yes, that was how we did it, because there was no way of knowing really how much we needed, and so we just came up with an arbitrary figure of £3 million. We recommended this. We didn't expect it to happen, but lo and behold, it did happen. The British Casino Association with Penny Cobham managed to get all the other trade associations together to come up with what they first of all called the Gambling Industry Charitable Trust. And so shortly after the Budd report came out, I was asked to be a trustee of the Gambling Industry Charitable Trust, which I didn't want to do, but I thought as I'd recommended it, I'd better at least be on it. I mean, if anyone had a responsibility to be on it, it was probably me. So for most of the last 20 years, I've been on, it was first of all the Gambling Industry Charitable Trust, then it was called the Responsibility in Gambling Trust, and I think it became something else with a similar set of initials, and then another set of initials, and now it's Gamble Aware. And for the last few years, I've stopped now. I was the chair of the research committee of Gamble Aware, and although I didn't commission the research on the fixed odds betting terminals that the Gambling Commission has relied on, I was the chair when we received this report. And it was really an incredible thing to have been involved with, because for 9 months we got all the data from, I think, 5 high street bookies on the use of their fixed odds betting terminals. And I believe there were 9 billion bets placed in that time. I may be exaggerating, it might have only been 6 billion in 9 months, but it was billions of bets were placed. And so we had this unique opportunity to try to observe people's behavior. But it was very, very difficult to do it, because most of the gambling is anonymous. Unless you've got a loyalty card, we don't know how long someone's gambling for. We don't know whether they're gambling twice a day, once a month. So it's only the tracked play where we could really be sure about how people were gambling. And even then, people sometimes lent their loyalty card to someone else to build up their credits. They didn't always use their loyalty card. They might have loyalty cards with more than one bookmaker. So even then, we couldn't really track play. So we had to make lots of assumptions to work out how people were gambling on the fixed odds betting terminals. And we did see maximum losses. So apparently there was someone who lost £18,000 in one day playing on one of these machines in that time. But this was someone who went in with £18,000. And so the suggestion that was put back to us was that this was one of the most incompetent attempts at money laundering we've seen, rather than someone who was losing their weekly pay. And the average loss on these machines was much smaller than most people thought. So people were losing around about £8 to £10. That's an average loss for a 20-minute play, which is comparable with going, buying a pint in a newspaper or something and seeing that. So most of the losses were quite small. More importantly, though, where was problem gambling? How was problem gambling taking place? And there was a question about whether problem gambling related to stake. I think in our research we found it didn't really. So there was problem gambling behavior at every stake level. And so people who wanted to reduce problem gambling by reducing the stake really were confusing two different things. One was sort of addicted gambling, problem gambling in that psychological sense. And another was just the possibility of losing a large amount of money in a short time, which, of course, the higher the stake, the more likely that is to be. And so at the moment, we are looking at trying to distinguish problem gambling in the sort of clinical psychological sense from a broader category of gambling-related harm, and thinking about how can you reduce gambling-related harm even when there isn't an addiction. So if you think of a young person who spent their entire wages once in a 20-minute session on the slot machines, that is a form of gambling-related harm, but it's not problem gambling in any clinical sense. They might never do it again. Or they might do it 2 or 3 times and then learn their lesson and never do it again. But you also have people who are addicted gamblers who are gambling much less, but it's a very significant part of their weekly earnings. And so what do we do about that? Well, playing around with stakes is not the answer. And I think this is a Gambling Commission's report says this, that if all you're doing is trying to change the stakes to eradicate problem gambling, you won't get there. You need to do other things. You need to have, for example, tracked play. Now, that is an easy thing to write down in a report, but what does it mean? I mean, it means every customer has to have a loyalty card if they're going to play at all. So that would be a massive culture change and probably incredibly expensive and would reduce business an enormous amount. So tracked play, even though from a player safety point of view, is maybe important in terms of allowing business to run in a business-like fashion, may not happen. So I think in terms of problem gambling, there's still a lot of work to be done in thinking about player protections. I'll just leave you with, just running out of time, I think now, so I'll just leave you with something that Peter Collins, who is really one of the most thoughtful people in this area, said at an early conference. So at a conference I went to, someone from the audience had raised a question about whether problem gamblers were good for business or bad for business. And it was talking mostly about casinos. And Peter Collins said, no, you might think they're good for business, but they're terrible for business. They try to borrow money off other customers, they irritate people, they don't go away, they don't leave their table, they don't leave their seat when it's time to go to the toilet and so on. So you have lots of problems with problem gamblers. What you want are customers who will cheerfully hand over 10% of their disposable income for the rest of their lives. And I thought this is actually probably what everyone wants in business. You want to give people a product that they're cheerful about it, they know they're going to be spending their money, but they enjoy it, and they don't resent it, and they like it, and they'll tell their friends about it, and they'll be quite happy to do it. So getting that regular customer, someone who's going to come back and back and back. Peter Collins' view is that a problem gambler is not going to be that right person. They might give you a lot of money in a short time, but they'll cause you more problems. I think this is quite a nice way of sort of thinking of a harmony between the regulation and the business, and giving you that social license to operate, that just because we think gambling is okay, it doesn't mean we think the industry is okay. And the industry has to do things to make that smoother all round. Okay, so I think I'm out of time, so time to finish.